What's the first thing that comes to mind if I say the Texas Chain Saw Massacre? It could be its suited and booted antagonist, Leatherface, or the menacing whir of a chainsaw. It could be Sally's interminable chase scene, or Franklin's incessant whining. Maybe it's the family dinner scene, which inspired media such as Resident Evil 7 and Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses. For myself and many others, however, it's the colour yellow. Co-written and directed by Tobe Hooper in 1974, the Texas Chain Saw Massacre is still considered to this day one of horror's most iconic. Its violent and depraved reputation could have something to do with its labeling as a video nasty during the 25-year ban from 1975 to 2000. However, much of the gore is implied and, by today's standards, even tame. There are so many elements that contribute towards its infamy, but I'm particularly intrigued by its use of colour as a cinematographic device, especially in the cemetery scene. The cemetery scene is the third of three scenes in the opening sequence of the Texas Chain Saw Massacre. My theory is that yellow is used here to heighten your emotional state at the very beginning of the film, so that for the remainder of the runtime you're more susceptible to intensified fear in reaction to implied violence. This way, yellow acts as a substitute for on-screen violence throughout the film. In order to discuss why yellow elicits the same emotions associated with gore, I'll be using various models of colour theory, including both subjective and objective perspectives. Key figures I'll refer to include Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Johannes Itten, who predominantly argue for a phenomenological perspective, which is based in the study of philosophy, and asserts that our experience of colour is subjective. I'll also look at Max Luscher and Angela Wright, whose methods are rooted in science based on empirical experiments and argue for an objective experience of colour. As well as this, I'll also incorporate more recent arguments advocating for the collaboration of philosophical and science-based approaches. These theorists emphasize the importance of acknowledging both context and metaphors when discussing the psychological impact of colour. When referring to each model, I'll be talking about one of three themes in relation to on-screen violence. My theory is that yellow represents volatile ethics and morals, impurity, and death, all of which can be associated with on-screen violence. Colour theory is helpful in understanding yellow's place within the broader context of the scene. However, I have to place emphasis on the fact that the inclusion of yellow was a creative decision made by Daniel Pearl, the head of cinematography. According to an interview with Pearl for the American Society of Cinematography, for this particular opening shot, Pearl relied on the homemade wooden camera rig devised by his crew. Mounted to its end is a tiny wind-up Bolex 16mm camera. The Texas Chain Saw Massacre was shot on 16mm colour reversal film, with the intention of going directly to a 35mm blow-up into negative, to then make 35mm theatrical release prints. Shooting on 16mm colour reversal film in bright sunlight produces a highly saturated yellow colour, since this particular film stock is inclined towards warmer tones like yellow and orange. It's this iconic hue of yellow washing over the cemetery scene that we'll be exploring in this video. And without further ado, let's get into the nitty-gritty of it. No pun intended. Let's start with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's theory of colours. Goethe's approach to colour theory is from a phenomenological perspective, as he argues colour is, quote, immediately associated with the emotions of the mind. In her book, The Culture of Yellow, or the Visual Politics of Late Modernity, Sabine Durand discusses Goethe's model of colour theory, stating, Goethe asserts that colour is a fusion of light and darkness according to the principle of polarity, which is the synthesis of opposites. Goethe states that there are two categories within this principle of polarity, plus and minus, with yellow falling into the plus category. Because yellow falls into the plus category, Goethe asserts that it's nearest to the light and excites a warm and agreeable impression. The idea that yellow belongs to the plus category and is nearest to the light introduces the idea that Goethe's theory on colours creates a hierarchical structure of morality. Using this model, yellow should be at the very top of this structure. When discussing the psychological impact of yellow, Goethe declares that yellow, in its highest purity, always carries with it the nature of brightness and has a serene, gay, softly exciting character. However, it is, on the other hand, extremely liable to contamination and produces a very disagreeable effect if sullied. Durand argues that Goethe's hierarchical structure based upon light suggests an ethical fickleness to yellow. She states that yellow's ethical dimensions, the shift between the highest and lowest moral values, also points to the potential violence inherent in yellow's turn from the most positive to most negative values. Goethe confirms yellow's mercurial morality in this final statement. By slight and scarcely perceptible change, the beautiful impression of fire and gold is transformed into one not undeserving of the epithet foul, and the colour of honour and joy is reversed to that of ignominy and aversion. From this perspective, it can be argued that the overwhelming presence of yellow in the cemetery scene foreshadows moral and ethical volatility, both in the contents of the film and from the viewer's perspective too. We begin with a group of innocent hippie teenagers on their way to check if a grave belonging to the grandfather of two members, Sally and Franklin, is still intact. We know this because of the radio segment that coincides with the cemetery scene, describing a recent grave robbing and defamation. The intention of the group is pure of heart, and the day ahead is filled with endless sun and laughter, a saccharine sweet start to the bloodbath that beckons. The contrast between the way the film begins and the events that quickly follow reflect the same volatility yellow represents. A good day gone very, very wrong, leaving the viewer screaming, "Bad things like this shouldn't happen to good people like that!" This exclamation of injustice demonstrates the fact that most people understand that killing is ethically wrong by the standards we live by in contemporary society. But generally speaking, watching good, kind, generous people being killed in horrific ways is much, much worse. This feeling is particularly strong a few minutes after the cemetery scene, in which the good-hearted teens pick up a hitchhiker. Ignoring their gut instinct that this person may not be safe, their suspicions are proven correct when this hitchhiker becomes violent after demanding payment but receiving none for a photo he takes of Franklin. This is the first point in which morality comes to the forefront of our minds. These teenagers welcome the hitchhiker into their van, albeit naively, but because they believe doing such a thing to be morally right. In return, they're faced with a crazed lunatic waving a knife in their faces. The presence of yellow in the cemetery scene foreshadows the moral dilemma and begs the question: do these teenagers really deserve to be treated this way because of their overly innocent view of the world? Throughout the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, the viewer has to fight an internal moral battle, since the teens we're all meant to be rooting for are actually quite annoying. Not only does their blind naivety land them in situations that could have been avoided, but it's almost as if they expect safety to be handed to them. Kirk and Pam show no signs of fear walking up to a complete stranger's house in the middle of nowhere, never stopping to think about the consequences of trespassing. This, of course, was done on purpose, though. For his 3-part documentary series, A History of Horror, Mark Gatiss interviews Tobe Hooper, who says,
It's all about a very bad day. I mean, it's a bad day for everyone. It's a terrible day for Leatherface. Leatherface, he keeps wondering where the hell are all these kids coming from. To the point he goes, sits down by the window and looks out, and then he starts patting his face because he knows his ass is in such terrible trouble.
The moral conflict we face here has us asking ourselves, aren't good people meant to have happy endings? Even more so, shouldn't we want these kinds of people to survive? Hooper plays on our moral compass by directing the film in a way that leads us to realize only after some time that this is Leatherface's story. The teenagers, to Leatherface, exist only as meat he has to slaughter. To him, there is no other possible way of reprimanding these meddlesome kids. This is clear in his immediate choice to butcher each of the teens. There's no hesitation, no stalking or prowling as with other famous villains such as Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, or Art the Clown. Leatherface simply acts. The lack of malice in his actions is likely what causes an internal moral conflict. Can we really hate a character that has no premeditated intention of harming others? The scene of Leatherface sat in the window shaking his head, as Hooper discussed, clearly demonstrates his own struggle to navigate the morality of the situation, proving that he is not the personification of evil. Much as with the colour yellow, Leatherface is morally grey. Goethe states that yellow has both the capacity to represent brightness and serenity, as well as ignominy and aversion. It falls on both the highest and lowest ranks within the moral hierarchy of colour. Yellow is unpredictable and changeable in nature. The cemetery scene introduces the idea that the state of morality in this film is capricious, both in the characters and in the experience of the viewer. The introduction of moral irregularity so early on in the film contributes towards the substitution for on-screen violence, as any explicit gore also elicits moral ambiguity just by witnessing it as a viewer. In this next section, I'm going to discuss Johannes Itten's approach to colour theory, using the elements of colour translated by Ernst van Hagen as my source material. This is a condensed and simplified version of Itten's original, The Art of Colour. Itten, Goethe's successor and master at the famous Bauhaus from 1919 to 1923, also argued for a phenomenological approach to colour theory. Itten crafted a 12-part colour circle and theorized that there are 7 types of colour contrast: hue, light-dark, cold-warm, complementary, simultaneous, saturation, and extension. My theory is that Itten's approach to colour theory, using his light-dark model, can be easily related to the concept of impurity within the context of the Texas Chain Saw Massacre. Similarly to Goethe, Itten uses the term polarity in his discussion of light and darkness, and refers to our experience of day and night, stating, "Day and night, light and darkness, this polarity is of fundamental significance in human life and nature generally." In his light-dark exercise, in which a scale of brilliance and darkness is used to compare chromatic and achromatic hues, Itten articulates the complex nature of yellow, declaring, "The exercise of painting all houses in the same brilliance as yellow is difficult because it is not immediately recognized how brilliant yellow is. It is similarly difficult to render yellow as dark as red or blue. This suggests yellow in its purest form is a bright, brilliant hue. However, as Goethe also suggested, it becomes less yellow the darker you try to render it. Unlike red or blue, which remained in their original state, just darker in brilliance." Itten's assertion that yellow is the only hue that can be quickly muddied is similar to Goethe's theory that yellow can be quickly sullied. Even the slightest modicum of darkness added to yellow reduces its brilliance and renders it impure. This idea of impurity suggests that yellow is no longer inherently yellow in nature. It morphs into something else entirely. If yellow can quickly shift from pure to impure, its presence in the cemetery scene foreshadows each of the teenagers' fates, especially considering that this hue of yellow is muddy and dingy. Each of the characters, aside from our final girl Sally, is dehumanized by their way of death, from human to meat product, from person to thing. In this transition, we experience human innocence rendered corrupt, degraded by the way in which Leatherface chooses to butcher his victims. Each character undergoes a rapid change in state, altered permanently by the darkness that looms behind that painted mask. The concept of cannibalism is obviously central to this film. The Sawyer family home is an abattoir, Leatherface is their butcher, and the teens are farm animals, blissfully unaware of the violent end that awaits. During the hitchhiker scene I mentioned earlier, Franklin and the hitchhiker discuss the change in method by which animals are killed in the slaughterhouse, from sledgehammer to airgun. The teens soon learn that the hitchhiker comes from a family of slaughterhouse workers.
Hey man, did you go in that slaughter room or whatever they call it? The place where they shoot the cattle in the head with that big air gun thing.
Oh, that gun's no good.
I was in there once with my uncle.
No way. With a sledge. See, that was better. They died better that way.
This morbid discussion suggests that there is a pure and impure way of dying, either quick and painless or slow and agonizing depending on where you stand. Leatherface does not simply kill and move on to the next, slicing and dicing his way through the teens. His way of butchering is almost ritualistic. When he murders each character, he follows the same method as he would in the slaughterhouse, preparing each person to be cooked and eaten later on. From his point of view, it's entirely possible that this is the purest way for a person to die. The correct way, the only way that he knows. From the teenager's point of view, however, this is quite possibly one of the worst ways to go. Reduced to an object, hung on a meat hook, placed in a freezer, cooked and eaten. Any sense of peace or calm is entirely removed. Each character will have died in an utter state of panic, much like the cows in the slaughterhouse. There could not be a more dehumanizing way of dying, and therefore impure way of greeting death. I mentioned earlier that the yellow dominating the cemetery scene is muddy, the impure yellow that Itten describes in his light-dark study. This particular hue is reminiscent of infected wounds, blisters, boils, and pus, the type of yellow that signifies an impure, diseased body quickly on its way to death. This is reflected in the set design, littered with rotting roadkill, decaying animals, as well as skeletal remains of both animals and humans. In an interview originally for the Dutch magazine Nieuwe Revue and later published in full length for the Flashback Files, Tobe Hooper talks about the set design. Hooper stated, quote, "We needed stuffed animals to decorate the set, domestic animals that the family members would have been working on. So I asked art director Bob Burns to find some, but he couldn't find any stuffed domestic animals. So I said to Bob, just figure this out, please." So on the day of shooting the dinner scene, a big dump truck pulls up at the house. It had one of these hydraulic beds, and they dump all of these animal cadavers at the back of the house. 100 at least. Dogs, cats, everything. They came from the city pound and had just been euthanized. It totally freaked everyone out, including me. The presence of impure, infected, decaying corpses in the set design is established from the very beginning in the cemetery scene. A filthy, grimy yellow exaggerates this horror and forewarns us of the contaminated hell that awaits Sally in the Sawyer slaughterhouse. The presence of this impure yellow in the cemetery scene also adds a cyclical element to the film, since the final scene has the same hue washing over Leatherface, as he casts a morbid silhouette against the burning sky. Swinging his chainsaw around in fury and defeat, Sally escapes in a pickup truck. This way, the yellow not only foreshadows the inhuman fate of Sally's friends, but also the impurity of Leatherface being unable to complete his mission of eliminating the teens. His plan is ruined, and it's almost as though Sally is the impurity in what would have been a perfect end to Leatherface's day. For this section, I'll be using empirical models of colour theory. Max Luscher and Angela Wright both have a science-based approach to colour theory, and although their individual tests differ, both argue for an objective and universal experience of colour. The Luscher test involves 7 colour panels and requires 43 selections to be made from 73 colour patches and 25 hues and shades. The results of this test attempt to prove the overall physiological and psychological well-being of the individual. In a similar way to Luscher, Wright uses colour theory to examine the psychological state of a person. In her paper, A Theory of Colour Psychology and Colour Harmony, Wright states that, quote, all colours can be classified into one of 4 groups, and the group a colour is in determines how it will affect a psychological mode. Wright believed that this model could be used to categorize all of humanity into these 4 groups, in which people share psychological and physical characteristics. In his book, The Luscher Colour Test, Luscher states, the colours of nature have had their influence on us, and these influences are deep-seated in our physiological and psychological makeup. And to understand why our experience of colour is removed from intersectional socio-economic context, we must look back at man's long exposure to the colours of nature. In reference to the colour yellow, Luscher states that it is inherently associated with daytime. Day brought an environment in which action was possible, thus providing him with both energy and incentive. The colour associated with daytime is bright yellow. Therefore, bright yellow is the colour of hope and activity. Wright similarly declares that colour is an innate response formed by millions of years of survival mechanisms, which is why she was able to categorize all of humanity into 4 unique groups. She states, we react to the seasons, and along with changes in temperature and daylight, colour is a principal signal that the seasons are changing. So we are affected by the colours that surround us and adapt our behaviour. According to this statement, yellow could simultaneously represent the plenitude of life in summertime, or the end of all living things in the autumn. Based on these theories, I'm going to discuss yellow as the embodiment of death. The assertion that our psychological response to colour is linked to humanity's relationship with nature suggests that yellow should be a symbol of abundance, but this is subverted in the Texas Chain Saw Massacre. In a journal published by the Cambridge University Press in 1937, philosopher Wallace Chapman wrote an essay on colour, in which he writes, yellow being the colour of sunlight, gold, and corn, is strongly charged with emotion. If yellow is associated with the abundance of nature during summertime, it should be a symbol of life, but here, yellow is the harbinger of death. It creates a juxtaposition as the Grim Reaper that generates an even stronger sense of the macabre. In an article by Miyako Plains on the presence of yellow in the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, she writes the film's true horror lies in the stifling environment that's reinforced over and over again through its visual landscape, one largely dominated by the colour yellow. On the other hand, since yellow can signify the changes in seasons, it can also act as an overt manifestation of death. The luscious flora and fauna of summertime begin to decay during the autumn, as the trees' leaves transition from brilliant greens to languid yellows. Yellow during this time is a representation of the barren winter months to come. Much like the characters' lives coming abruptly to a halt, so does the vitality of summertime. Combined with the themes I've already discussed, morality and impurity, yellow as the embodiment of death enhances its ability to act as a supplement for on-screen violence. The corpse in the foreground of the cemetery scene, backlit by an ungodly yellow, produces a foreboding atmosphere. Even before any of the characters are slaughtered by Leatherface, we're aware that death is the true antagonist of the film. I am also going to argue that the presence of yellow as a symbol of daytime, according to Luscher, is juxtaposed by implied gore, making the implication as strong and intense as an overt depiction. On a bright summer's day, there should be no need to fear any lurking predator or looming threat. Here, however, the opposite is true. This, in turn, ignites a sense of primal fear in reaction to the possibility of death. It's as though Pearl took the idea of what a scene draped in sunlight should look like and subverted it completely. The sky is preternaturally yellow instead of a brilliant blue, hanging over a melting corpse. The dominance of yellow implies that there is something very, very wrong here, and that things are not going to return to normal anytime soon. Since you would expect to see a different colour palette painting the sky above the graveyard, that sense of primal fear is only heightened and sustained throughout the remainder of the film, as your worst suspicions are confirmed. It only adds to the horror of the situation for such depravity to expose itself during broad daylight. The idea of something unknown and maybe threatening looming in the darkness is to be expected, but for terror to expose itself in the daytime is petrifying. You have no time to build up to fear. Within the first 3 minutes of the film, you're exposed to a shocking landscape drenched in a sickening languid yellow. Your stomach drops, and you know that fear has established itself as your base emotional state for the next hour and 20 minutes. In the same interview I mentioned earlier for the flashback files, Hooper says, "That's why I open the film in a graveyard. You're immediately repelled by the stuff, like the sight of a coffin." Even in the voiceover that introduces the film, it's stated that, for them, an idyllic summer's afternoon drive became a nightmare, written in bold, yellow typography.
For them, an idyllic summer afternoon drive became a nightmare.
The imagery of a calming summer's day is starkly contrasted by the loitering possibility of a hellish fate, represented by the surreality of a nightmare. Hooper also discussed with Mark Gatiss the importance he wanted to place on death as a core theme.
Before I'm making Chainsaw, I started really considering what makes horror work based on my experience of seeing films. And I found, to me, that films set in and around death gave it an additional tone, because the death is the ultimate monster. Also, I wanted to show that the process of death wasn't as simple as sticking someone with a knife and 2 frames later they expire.
Considering Hooper himself acknowledged both the importance of opening with a cemetery scene and the close proximity of death, yellow, as the embodiment of these themes, is certain. This analysis would not be possible without the combination of all perspectives within the study of colour theory, both phenomenological and empirical. One lens should not be held in superiority to another, since really the most important lens of all is context. When context is taken into consideration, it provides a groundwork for all theories to work in tandem with one another. Goethe, Itten, Luscher, and Wright have all provided relevant and valid theories. Each have contributed towards my thesis on the importance of yellow in relation to on-screen violence in the Texas Chain Saw Massacre. In this section, I'm going to explore how these more recent theorists' perspectives can provide some extra context. In the studies I've looked at that were conducted in the past 10 years, it's argued by academics that traditional models of colour theory are responsible for an oversimplified understanding of the way we experience colour. In a study conducted by a group of researchers, Briggs, Westland, Hirschler, and Schwartz, they argue that Goethe's theory on colours is pseudoscientific and contradictory. This is because Goethe simultaneously suggested that our experience of colour is both subjective, while also stating inherent qualities of each hue, such as yellow having a nature of brightness and a serene, gay, soft quality to it. Because of this contradictory suggestion, our experience and understanding of colour is massively oversimplified. This group of researchers contends that the way and intensity with which colour can affect us is extremely diverse, and the factors that play a role in this are highly complex. This may suggest that a quick-paced jump to conclusions might actually limit our capacity to understand a multitude of factors in the way that colour affects us, such as individual experience, intersectionality, and socio-economic factors. Despite disproving the validity of Goethe's theory on colours, the researchers also acknowledge the inconclusivity of empirical studies. If one considers the general results of all empirical studies conducted to date, With the aim of generating generalizable statements about the harmony of colors, it can be concluded that in accordance with everyday view, color harmony remains primarily a matter of personal taste. The researchers instead place emphasis on context when considering the psychological impact of color. They declare every color may have multiple or even contradictory meanings depending on context. More seriously, the meanings that colors have often vary with context and culture, and even between individuals. According to this theory, it's the context of the film that makes yellow an effective substitute for on-screen violence. Since it's introduced so early on and paired with a cemetery filled with rotting corpses, every time yellow is reintroduced throughout the film, you're reminded of violence and gore, even if there isn't any on screen. Since Leatherface's apron is yellow, and so is his chainsaw, every time he is present and a character dies, yellow is present too. Then, when there is a lack of on-screen blood, yellow compensates. As I mentioned previously, yellow is particularly notable in the final scene, in which Leatherface is swinging his chainsaw around while a boundless yellow sky stretches endlessly above him. Sally has escaped, laughing maniacally at her victory. The sickening and overwhelming flooding of yellow may disguise itself with beauty, but it's just another reminder of the fact that all of her friends are dead, and she only narrowly escaped the horrific fate of a chainsaw-wielding lunatic. In a recent book published in 2016, Handbook of Color Psychology, Brian Mayer wrote an essay in which he discusses the role of metaphors in our current understanding of color theory. In this essay, Do Metaphors Color Our Perception of Social Life? Mayer argues that metaphors aid in communication because they help one understand abstract concepts in more concrete terms that are easier to comprehend. Within the context of color, positive emotions and experiences are often depicted in terms of lightness rather than darkness, so lightness is metaphorically linked to good, i.e., seeing the light. Since Mayer asserts that metaphors make abstract concepts easier to understand, yellow is a metaphor for on-screen violence. If yellow is generally associated with happiness and positivity due to reinforcement by metaphors in language, its subversion in the Texas Chain Saw Massacre makes it even more of an effective device as a substitute for on-screen violence. Yellow is established as a symbol of the macabre early on in the film. We make an immediate association between yellow and gore because of the cemetery scene. Therefore, when yellow is present throughout the remainder of the runtime, so is the concept of violence. Looking outside of my window while conducting research for this video essay, I watched the tree's leaves turn from a brilliant green to a bleak yellow, eventually falling to the ground for the earth to consume. I saw animated yellow flowers slowly begin to droop, morphing into dull and lifeless ghosts of what they once were. Suddenly, passers-by in yellow raincoats became harbingers of death. The yellow glow from my lamp cast a morbid luminosity, and the yellow lines paved into the winding roads below led people walking beside them beyond the veil and into another realm. Before making this video, if you were to ask me what I associated yellow with, I probably would have said Easter, summertime, daffodils, floral dresses, or lemons, I guess. And ironically enough, yellow has always been my least favorite color. But now that I've delved into yellow's capacity for such morbidness, as an avid horror fan who maybe has a slightly unnatural interest in the macabre, I have a lot more respect for yellow. Despite conflicting approaches to color theory, all of the theorists I looked at essentially came to the same conclusion about yellow. Yellow should be a symbol of daytime, hope, and brightness because of its proximity to light, so its presence in scenes of utter depravity only heightens your emotional reaction. Much like Leatherface hiding beneath a mask made of human skin, every time you see yellow, you're reminded of the explicit violence hiding beneath its facade. And yeah, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, stay tuned for more horror-fueled content, and I'll see you next time. Or not.